Ladies and gentlemen, the session will now begin. Please take your seats.
The trading system, with the World Trade Organization at its center, is under attack from three fronts: the United States' rule-breaking unilateral policies, China's non-conforming state capitalist system, and the WTO's own difficulties in moving forward an increasingly complex trade agenda. Whether the system can survive depends crucially on the willingness of the United States and China to compromise. Changes are also required from other WTO members, not least the European Union, the largest trading bloc. What are the underlying causes of the impasse? What are possible scenarios moving forward? What will be the impact on smaller countries that depend on trade, and how should they react?
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage our moderator for the Will the Rules-Based Trading System Survive session, President and CEO of Yearwood Media Group, John Yearwood.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for hanging in there with us, and I hope that you're enjoying the Atlantic Dialogues. I just want to just say a few things, both to you and to folks watching around the world, that this is an extremely important conversation we're about to have, and it's affected just about everybody, not only in here, but also who are watching us at home, because these trade institutions, whether they survive, is something that ultimately would depend on how fat your pocketbook and wallet is, ultimately. So we'll get into some of that, but I also want to let you know that I want this conversation we're about to have to be about you, and I want you to be very much a part of this conversation, which is one of the things that we do here at the Atlantic Dialogues. It isn't just about the folks on stage. I'll help guide the conversation, but we want you, everyone in here, to be very much involved, which is why we'll have a question that you'll be able to answer here in a few minutes, and then have questions for our panelists. So as we get started, I'll call our panelists to the stage. We'll start with Uru Dadush, who is the Senior Fellow at the Policy Center for the New South and a consultant to the World Bank and other institutions. Then we have Matthias Fekl. Matthias is a former Minister of the Interior and State Secretary of Foreign Trade with the Government of France. And last but certainly not least, we have Renato Flôres, who is the economist and former member of the group of experts with the WTO. Please help me welcome our guests. And as Renato makes his way to the stage, please take out your iPad or your iPhone or other devices. We have a question that we'd like you to answer so we can get a sense of the room as we begin the conversation about rules-based institutions. The question, which should be popping up here in a second, is, will the rules-based system survive? And if you would vote yes or no, will the rules-based trading system survive? And we'll have a few seconds. We're almost there. Wow.
Oh, voila.
Okay,
that's why we have the panel. That's why we have the panel.
This is, gentlemen, welcome. Hopefully, and we'll return to this question at the end of our conversation. Gentlemen, let's start, Uri, with you and rules-based trade system. there are a lot of issues that have come up, and maybe one of the issues that some people are concerned about. You look, for example, at China in the WTO. China is considered a developing country within the WTO, although it has the world's second largest economy. So what we're looking at is a country that is both the oppressor and the oppressed. Is that not laughable?
Well, yeah, I wouldn't describe China either as oppressor or as oppressed. But it is true that one of the issues we are confronting in the sustainability of the system, of the trading system, is the explosion of China onto the world scene since its accession to the WTO in 2001 and even before that. And how China fits into the system is one of the big problems. It's by far, in my view, not the biggest problem. There are other problems. But the fact is that you have an economy that is now the largest trading nation of the world in a rules-based, liberal, free trade economic system, which is still very much a state-driven economy, and with a huge state sector, less big than it was in the past, and furthermore, a state sector that is guided by a central authority, which is the Communist Party and the head of the Communist Party in that country. Moreover, while China made a lot of progress in terms of liberalizing its economy, relying more on the private sector in the many years, several years post-accession to the WTO, in recent years, that reform process has slowed. And that is one of the tension points because a lot of countries are very worried about China. If you look at the trade deficit of Morocco, you will see that one of the reasons that has been widening trade deficit in Morocco is, in fact, a very important reason is that the trade deficit with China has increased a lot. Okay? Now, I'm a trade economist and a free trader, and I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but in political terms, it's complicated.
I want to turn to Matthias and ask you about, I know I want to touch on the China question, but also I want you to also address some issues involving what's happening with Brexit. But I know you were very much involved in some of the conversations, negotiations with China in France. What do you think in terms of China and getting a lot of preferences within, for example, the WTO, but at the same time has a ginormous economy?
First of all, let me thank you for having me here and congratulate and thank the great staff of the Policy Center for this organization and this event. Concerning China, I think that we, and we could mean a lot of people, have been quite naive since the beginning of the years 2000, when China integrated the WTO. I was trade minister when we had to discuss the accession of China to developed economic status, and you know there was a big debate about is it automatic after 15 years, or does China have to meet precise criteria? And we were discussing that in the European Council. But when you look at the accession protocol of 2001, there is lots of ambiguity. And on such issues, I think it is a problem for Europe, but also for southern countries, and today for the US, to be ambiguous. And 20 years passed, I think everybody was in the idea, maybe even ideology, that trade would bring peace, would bring democracy, and would bring sustainable development everywhere. And it is true that trade has reduced inequalities between countries, but at the same time, it has increased, very much increased, inequalities amongst countries. And this is why, within countries. And this is why today, this is one of the reasons at least, why we have the rise of populism, why we have doubt about globalization, why we have in the US, in the UK with Brexit, but also in France, maybe not yet in Germany, but it might come, more and more doubt about did we make the good choices? I think that's where we stand today, a complete shift of paradigm, a complete shift of approaches within amongst political leaders, but also in the world of theory and thinking.
But that's a good question if you can answer it before I go up to Renato. Did we make did you make the best decision because you were very much involved in the China discussions, among others?
It's not for me to judge, but in 2001 I was studying, so I don't know. In 2015-16, I think that Europe as such, Europe as a whole, the European Union, made a balanced approach, and that we were able to implement criteria so that we can implement trade defense measures. That's the key. Of course we need trade, of course we need fair, balanced trade, but we need to have the tools to answer, and to answer in due time when there is an unequal approach, when there is unequal competition. And I think today Europe is stronger. It's not enough. Things are still too slow. But the European Union is conscious now that we have to stop being naive, and that public power at the European level needs to be able to answer and to defend our core interests.
Renato, I want to ask you about, since you're representing, to some extent, the South on our little panel, what would happen to many of the smaller, some undiversified states, should we have a collapse, if you will, of the world trading system?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, in about 4 hours, I believe the Chinese are going to bed, to sleep. So may I suggest that we wish them sweet dreams and a nice sleep, and leave them aside for a while. I'll address your question, but before, let me address the panel's question, which I think maybe could be interesting. My answer has 2 parts. The first one is, yes, it's going to survive. There is no doubt that in a multipolar world, interconnected as it is, we need to have a minimally rules-based trade system. So there will be one. So first part, yes. Second part, no. No. The present architecture of the WTO and its related developments won't survive. There will be a huge change. And until we have the new rules-based system, there will be apathy, there will be chaos, and then, here I address your question, because I think the right question is not the survival of the rules-based system, but which will be the winning coalition that will set the new rules? Will developing countries play a role? Will we witness an alliance of the European Union with China against the US? Or will the US eventually prevail? Or will the European Union, as usual, by the way, will eventually side with the EU and go against China? But China nowadays, good sleep, they present themselves as the champions of multilateralism. So I think the question, which is related to what you said, is what's going to be the winning coalition? How are the big powers, the smaller ones, and the little ones, but which can get together and have an impact, remember the Cancun Ministerial, going to arrange themselves and have a voice in the new rules?
I want to get back, and I'll get back to that, and probably I'll ask everyone the question of what do they see as an alternative to what we have now, if they're, in terms of what will survive. But Uri, I wanted to ask you about the United States, and some people have said that they have seen a lot of the turmoil, if you will, within the rules-based system can go back to 3 years ago. when a certain New Yorker became president. I wanted to ask you, spending a lot of time and living in the United States, do you see a justification for what President Trump is doing, whether it's with China or Mexico and Canada, as we've just seen, and others?
I'm not going to justify anything that President Trump is doing, and certainly not in public. But you're now dealing with the core question, which in my view is not China. The core question is the United States and the attitude of the United States towards the rules-based system. What has changed, because there's been a big change, right? 3 years ago, you wouldn't have predicted this kind of attitude from the United States, at least I didn't. And basically what has changed is a number of things. You need to understand just sort of schematically. The first has already been mentioned throughout this conference, and the minister just indicated it again. The rising inequality in the United States, and particularly the failure of a very large part of the population not to make progress, combined with the weakness of the safety nets in the United States. This is what makes it different from France and other European countries. A large part of the population is not seeing progress, and at the same time is in a high state of uncertainty because of the high cost of healthcare in the United States, and because of the high and rising cost of education in the United States. So that's one aspect that explains the rise of a populist administration. The second aspect, which is, I think, also very important and often misunderstood or not appreciated, is the fact that the United States used to absolutely need a rules-based trading system, which at that time was the GATT, but eventually became the WTO, because of the Cold War, Cold War I. We are now in Cold War II. Cold War I was against the former Soviet Union. Cold War II is the one we've already been discussing, which is China. But during Cold War I, which ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the United States needed the rules-based system because it was the underpinning of capitalism, which the Soviet Union wanted to, at least for a while, to destroy. This has changed. So the geopolitics that was underpinning the rules-based system, with the United States subjecting itself as a sovereign nation and the most powerful one in the world, willingly, to a system of rules, that geopolitical situation is radically transformed today, where China is certainly not trying to undermine the multilateral trading system. It is a champion of the multilateral trading system, but China is what the United States sees as the big rival. So you have the combination of those two things. And that explains a large part of the problem that we're facing at the moment. Now, I also believe, as Mr. Flôres has said, that this does not spell the end of the rules-based trading system, in part because we have to understand that the rules-based trading system is a lot deeper than the WTO appellate body, which the United States now is set on eliminating. That the rules-based trading system should be understood as a combination of WTO rules, regional arrangements, and domestic laws. And one thing is certain, and that is that the regional arrangements are increasing in importance. And we could list the very important regional arrangements that have been struck in the course of the last 2 to 3 years by the European Union, Japan, China itself, and now the United States is about to ratify NAFTA, which is by far the most important regional trading arrangement for the United States, accounting for a huge part of its trade.
But let's go back to WTO for a second. I just want to push you for a bit on China and whether or not, do you not think China needs to bear more of the blame for what we're seeing now? Because China was had given lip service to a lot of the agreements that it had signed on to and had not been, in many cases, fulfilling its responsibility.
Look, I am determined to underscore in front of this audience that the biggest issue is not China, it's the United States. And you can push me on China, I will tell you about China. But the real issue today is the United States. Now, on China, absolutely, it's been said, okay? And China is everybody's favorite beating boy at the moment. But the fact is, you know, the numbers, you have to look at the numbers. And the numbers say China has gone from a current account surplus of 10% of GDP in 2007, 2008, to essentially 0.5% of GDP last year. So it's very difficult to, well, before I say that, the other number you should look at is, you know, the Germans are some of the people that are most concerned about China within the European Union, as well as my country, France. Germany, the average German exports 12 times as much as the average Chinese. And of course, Germany has a huge current account surplus of 8% of GDP, whereas China is nearly imbalanced. So it's very difficult today, and the Chinese currency has appreciated by about 40% in real terms vis-à-vis the euro in the last 10 years. It's very difficult today to characterize China as the big predator on international markets. China is a huge export market and the largest export market for a large part of the developing countries. Okay, so that's my point on China, and that doesn't negate in any way the point that China has a different system and it needs to evolve, it needs to ensure that its different system is not translated into artificial competitive advantages on international markets, for which there are some provisions in the WTO, including anti-dumping, countervailing duties, safeguards. All this stuff is perfectly WTO legal to impose, so it's not like the crisis is out of control. China needs to make its changes, but let's underscore the fact that China has already done a lot.
If I can go to Renato for a minute, and I wanted to come back, do you not think that Yuri has a point about really the problem is the United States? You're in Brazil, you're looking at what the United States is doing very closely, and let's just take one example, the appellate court. We had a president in the U.S. who has never met someone he didn't want to sue. And, but in this case, he is saying that the appellate court has a problem because it's better to negotiate your way out of issues instead of taking people to court or taking countries to court. Is there not a point to what you were saying?
Well, I think that the United States, and nowadays the president is Mr. Trump, but this comes from also Mr. Obama and even before, the United States is doing what the hegemon would do. The system has no benefit or the amount of benefits it gave to him doesn't work anymore. So they want to change the system. Right. Appellate body, refusal to approve the judges started with Mr. Obama many times. More than 10 years ago, or maybe even 20 years ago, you have lots of papers and people from the US Trade Department saying that they were not happy with the judges in the appellate body overdoing their functions and exactly starting to improve in the Marrakesh Agreement, in the DSU, Dispute Settlement Understanding. There's a very interesting GATT language. They say the judges can't neither diminish or amend WTO rules. But it's true that in many rulings, they are contributing to enlarge the rules. And complaints about this are at least 15 years old. So in this case, if I were the United States, I would do the same thing. The point, I think, is that which countries they are going to alienate in the creation of this new order. But up to now, and well, the DSU is not shut, but the AB, the appellate body, has been shut in the middle of this week. And this gives them leverage. We are going to endure, to undergo about, I don't know, 2 or 3 months of a lame duck WTO. But it's part of their strategy. I think it's part of the game, no problem. But what are going to be the rules, and who are going to be their partners? That's the point. Or are they going to be defeated? Because the hegemon, someone said before, the hegemon also needs rules. It's not good for the hegemon to go and move freely without rules. The hegemon needs rules so that he can be credible. And the hegemon wants to be credible. So they will need rules, but who is going to help them?
I wanted to, unless Matthias wanted to address this issue, but you can actually, in answering my question, it has to do with Brexit. We saw some news, I think yesterday. We have a new continuing prime minister, and he comes in with a far more secure position, given his larger majority for the Conservatives. What impact do you see that happening on rules-based institutions?
I'd be happy after that to come back quickly maybe to the dispute settlement, if it's not too technical, but I think it's a key issue. On Brexit, first now things are clear. Since the referendum, everybody, lots of people in the UK, but also lots of people in the European Union thought that things might change, there might be a second referendum, maybe we could work on deals and so on. Now I think that things are very clear because the Prime Minister has a clear majority, and the British people who voted in a referendum on a difficult issue now confirmed this position. What's important now is the future of the relationship. It's not the divorce. The divorce is not yet done, but I mean everybody agrees that it will be done in a few months. In 2016, lots of commentators, analysts said, you know, since they entered the European Union, the UK had 1 foot inside the EU, 1 foot outside, and now it will be the opposite. That was quite an interesting approach. But I think that now it's clear that things will work quite differently. And you have different scenarios. You can be a common law partner, let's say, or a partner amongst other partners in WTA rules, nothing else. Then you can have a free trade agreement like we have with Canada. We have more than 40 free trade agreements with the whole world and the European Union. And then you can have something specific. But what's important for the Union, it's survival. Because if tomorrow other countries think that when you leave, you get rid of disciplines, you get rid of constraints, of rules, and you still keep all the benefits, then it's the end of the European project. And I think that it would weaken, maybe not all our countries, but at least the main countries of today's Union. That's why it's so important to be strong in the discussions, to be strong in the negotiations, and to find a good way to associate. I mean, we will remain partners. We are partners, as I experienced in other responsibilities, for anti-terrorism, for cooperation between our secret services. This will not change. But economically, we'll have to make clear that there is not the same access to the European market as was granted right now, and that European Union will define its own priorities, its own values, and its own interests.
I know as we... Okay, Renato.
Just an observation, Mr. Chairman. I thought that the European Union was paradise, and if someone wants to quit paradise, he goes to hell. Just leave him. So why to be so fierce and harsh against this person? I don't understand.
I don't think that in politics being too binary brings to a good solution. I never thought that Europe was...
That's what the rhetoric of the European Union says.
No, but I never agreed to that rhetoric, and I don't think that it's paradise. I think there are lots of things to be changed. I think, as I said before, that we've been naive for too much time, and I think at the same time that we are stronger together than we would be if we are completely separate. So that's all the difficulty of the European project.
Yeah.
Maybe just one word on the appellate body, because the key question, including here in this panel, is, and it's very timely scheduled, when you see that since 2 or 3 days now, the WTO dispute settlement body will be paralyzed.
The appellate body.
Yes, but the whole dispute settlement body will then be paralyzed. When you cannot make an appeal, okay. What's the first instance? I mean,
you
we
can
could have a judicial
panels.
discussion.
You can submit panels.
Yeah. Yes, of course.
You can open panels. You can negotiate.
Yeah.
I know how it
it's hard.
Works.
It's hard, but not paralyzed.
Let's admit that it weakens the only place in globalization where rules can be implemented and where the parties have to respect them. I think that's a good way to put it. So the future, there are several scenarios. You can have a scenario where WTO slowly dies. I think it would be terrible, but it's possible. You can have a WTO without the US. Does it make sense?
Impossible.
I don't think so. You can have a WTO that reforms itself, and Director General Roberto Azevedo is working a lot on that. And then we will come back to the question you raised about what will be the winning coalition, even though, as you know, we need consensus at the WTO. And then you can have new approaches. You can have enhanced regional agreements, be it European Union, Mercosur, and so on, and you can have integration between regions. I believe that integration between Europe and Africa, Northern Africa and Africa as a whole, is a very important thing. And you can have, as started for 2 or 3 examples at the WTO, agreements that are not done by consensus amongst all members, but agreements that are plurilateral, not universal, but plurilateral, and then you have opt-in clauses and others can join. But I'm convinced that in the future we will need places to implement rules, be they public, WTO being the main place, be they private, but that's why we worked a lot on the reform on the investment arbitration, which is to put rules between private parties, and there too we need a public power worldwide to be able to implement principles, rules, and values. Otherwise, and I will conclude on that, otherwise you go back to the 1920s, 1930s, where recession, then protectionism, nationalism, resulted in a contraction of the world markets, and then you know what happened. So things never happen exactly the same way, of course, but it's interesting to note that WTO global trade rules that in the beginning were challenged more from the left might now be killed from quite tough right. I think everybody should reflect on that.
Well, that chaos of the 1920s and 30s also produced a system that we have now. Yes, which may, in some cases...
But everybody, I think, hopes that we will avoid what happened in between, which was the worst tragedy in human history.
Exactly. We don't want to necessarily go back there. But I want to go to Yuri, but before that, I just want to mention that I'll be coming to the audience next, and those of you with questions, particularly the ones who said no, that the system is not going to survive, I'd love to get your input and your intervention in our conversation. So you wanted to add?
There's one point I want to underscore, because I'm very conscious of the fact that, you know, we are dealing with an audience of decision makers. And I think it's important not to give the wrong message about, you know, the collapse of the system and stuff like that. I'll be specific. If you are a European country, let's say you're France, and you're looking at the new world, you can be sure of one thing, pretty sure of one thing. You can negotiate an agreement with the United Kingdom if you want to, and very likely it's going to happen. We don't know what shape it's going to have. Overall, your trade is protected probably to a level of, I haven't seen the numbers for France, but if you add up trade within the European Union, trade with the United Kingdom, which is still free, and trade with the 40 countries and territories with which the European Union has a free trade agreement, then the trade of France is protected by very well-established rules to about 80% of the total. It is trade with the United States and trade with China. Those are the big trading partners, even now with Japan and Canada, that is not protected. In the case of Morocco, because Morocco has a free trade agreement with the European Union, number one, it has a free trade agreement with the Arab world. It has a free trade agreement with the United States. It has a controversial free trade agreement with Turkey at this point. Something like 85%, I don't know the exact number, of Moroccan trade is under the aegis of these trade agreements, okay? So the WTO, the multilateral trading system, remains very, very important because it underpins in all sorts of ways the global system. But in a scenario where the WTO falters, which is unlikely, in my view, but in a scenario where the WTO falters, certainly countries like France and countries like Morocco will be very protected with rules for a large part of their trade. The countries that really need to worry are Brazil, for example, which has very few free trade agreements. The free trade agreement it has, Mercosur, which, by the way, is not working well, covers only a small part of its trade. And a country like India, which has just recently refused to join RCEP, the big regional agreement that is going to be signed in Asia, where China is the center. India is a country where, you know, a lot of its trade is basically governed by the WTO, and that's about it. So you have to look very specifically at the countries, and certainly I have no prediction that this rules-based system, broadly defined, is going to collapse. It will not collapse. It will continue to underpin globalization, and globalization will continue to advance.
Well, Renato, I guess Brazil doesn't have much to worry about, does it? Since it's going to survive.
Just two observations, if I may. One, all the free trade agreements existing, they are backed by the WTO. Without the WTO, they become much weaker. So that's an important point. Second point, I think it's very difficult to speculate on what's going to happen. But my guess, one guess I'm pretty sure, is that regional systems of rules won't happen because they are not in the interest of any country. Questions?
We have a question from, could you please stand and identify yourself?
I'm the research coordinator at ESP Milan.
Sorry, can't hear.
Okay, let's see. Okay, is there another one that's working? Okay.
But they have
I'm Antonio Villa again. So it's me.
It's not working? There we go.
Okay. So I'm Antonio Villafranca. I'm the research coordinator at ESP Milan. So far, we have been discussing, the support to WTO to multilateral trade system by states. But the point is that states and political leaders are not supporting this system because, some negative effects of these systems are not taken into account. I make an example, and of course, I'm addressing in particular the former French minister. What we do in the European Union. I mean, when the European Commission negotiates a trade agreement with South Korea, Canada, and so on, the European Commission must take into consideration the interest of the European Union as a whole, because this is what is written in the treaty. It is for, absolutely forced to do so. But what about the local impact of these trade agreements? I mean, the only preliminary assessment we do in the European Union on trade agreements is possibly on the impact on industries, okay? The point is that these industries in many European countries are specially located. So there could be a very negative aspect. And then I conclude. And in the European Union, we are not serious when we talk about cohesion policy and territorial policies, because you know perfectly that we only use a small percentage of the EU budget for cohesion policy. And the EU budget is just 1% of the EU GDP. It's just peanuts for cohesion, for problems which are related to trade agreements. Thank you.
Matthias, do you want to address that?
I completely agree, and that's part of the growing inequalities within countries. In 2016, I proposed, I don't think it's yet done, but that when we assess impacts, we do not only assess it globally for the Union as such, with sometimes numbers you don't really know where they come from, be it in favor of the agreement or against the agreement, but to have a precise impact on territories. In my country, in France, including in my former constituency, you see exactly what happens when when territories get disindustrialized. The link with populism is absolutely evident. And a second proposal I made is to have, on the European level, it concerns Europe, but it could be elsewhere, to have adjustment mechanisms. We already have some, but adjustment mechanisms to globalization. If you want people to agree to globalization, they have to be winners. If you tell them they will win, and they see that their jobs are going away, that their children will live a worse life than them, how do you want to vote for that? So I think this is a very, very important point. Second point, I'll be very short. Europe is not taking care enough of the implementation of its agreement. I looked at the numbers when I was in government. At the European level, for negotiation, you have civil servants doing it. All of them are great. They are not corrupt, they are competent, and they are doing what they are asked to, so that there be no ambiguity on that. But in numbers, you have people negotiating agreements, and you have people in charge of implementation. And the numbers are exactly the opposite in the US. We have more people to negotiate, so they spend their time negotiating more and more agreements without priorities, without really analyzing if we need them. And then on implementation, it's quite weak. In the US, and they are doing their job, they are very tough on implementation, and when something goes wrong, they react.
Question? Could you please stand? You know, you've got a lot of stuff.
Merci.
I think people want to see it from around the room, if you can stand up.
Je voudrais ajouter 2 éléments au débat. Premièrement, il est possible de relativiser l'impact de la guerre commerciale entre la Chine et les États-Unis, puisque les droits de douane imposés par Trump représentent un très très faible pourcentage, 0,1% du commerce mondial. Et de toute façon, dans une guerre commerciale, c'est perdant-perdant. Soit c'est le consommateur qui paye, soit c'est le producteur qui paye. Donc, il y a l'espoir que ce problème sera réglé. Le problème qui se pose, à mon sens, c'est qu'il s'agit d'une crise industrielle globale, grave, parce que le monde devient plus une économie de services. Et d'ailleurs, les pays qui ont des industries traditionnelles connaissent une récession. La Chine, en l'occurrence, un recul de la croissance, et l'Allemagne aussi est en récession. Ça, c'est le premier point. Le deuxième, il y a un retour des chaînes de valeur sur un plan régional, c'est-à-dire qu'on entre dans une nouvelle phase de la mondialisation. Et donc, c'est peut-être cette régionalisation, je ne veux pas dire retour au protectionnisme, mais disons une modification sur un plan régional, ça devrait peut-être impacter la révision de l'architecture, comme vous l'avez dit, de l'OMC, parce qu'il est clair que les conflits doivent se régler toujours dans un cadre légal et structuré. Là, nous sommes d'accord, et je n'ai pas répondu non à la question qui a été posée. Merci.
Merci. Question here?
Thank you. The panel seems to be very positive on the need for a rule-based system. Of course, the rules need to be updated and changed and reformed and all of that. But the way I look at it, it is the system with one set of rules for everybody. And among the everybody is a big country with a different system, different economic, social, political system. And therefore, the crisis we have now is fundamentally come from the incompatibility between one rule for all and different systems participating in the marketplace. How about, in your view, we move from a rule-based system to an outcome-based system, where every country has an obligation to make correction so that the outcome can be seen by citizens everywhere as being fair, reciprocal, and therefore more sustainable?
Thank you. Renato, do you want to take that?
Yes. Just take one more question.
Oh,
okay. Then I can address your point, because this is always at the root of, was at the root of GATT and was at the root of WTO. WTO was created in 1994. In 1998, there was this first clash because membership was increasing, and so you could have, it's not so easy, coalitions of developing countries against the big one. So green room techniques and all that would fail, because if you had a strong coalition, the G20 in agriculture was an example of this. So I think one of the big issues in the coming fight will be this, because I believe the big powers will want to change the voting system. We want to move swiftly, smoothly, nice and easy, but to something which is not exactly multilateral. This was aired after Cancun. Many people wrote about this. On the other hand, and here I'm speculating, I think that China will support multilateralism. So a big clash is going to be exactly this one.
Okay. Question?
I'm Francisco from Colombia, an emerging leader, and I work in financial technology. The question goes, in a world where Christine Lagarde is talking about Bitcoin cryptocurrencies, then you have the Facebook Libra, and now in the future you will have the Chinese government issue a new digital cryptocurrency. What will happen if they issue this cryptocurrency in the One Belt, One Road countries and they start implementing that? What will be the consequences for international trade, for the US dollar, and what the other countries could do about it?
Thank you. Since you want to take that again, Renato, since you're in his region?
No, I just profit what he said to join with the lady. Another issue that is going to come to the front when you rediscuss the rules is going to be internet trade, and then you have cryptocurrencies and all that. This is going to be a big issue because it's affecting trade. And the lady mentioned services, which the Uruguay round, we had a general agreement of trade on services, but we did not work very well, and services will come to the fore in the new discussion. So there is also the question of, beyond representativeness, new issues.
Hi, my name is Sarah La Morsapalli. I'm from the United States of America and India. So I just wanted to say that it's incredibly, incredibly reassuring to see that the panel echoes the sentiment that developing countries need to be prioritized, especially when it comes to pressure that's put by countries like the United States of America on countries like India. So my question is, when you see situations where the United States is finds new ways to impose regressive standards, such as saying that countries who are a part of the G20 or the OECD should not avail special benefits for being developing countries by the WTO. And you see this coming from, as you mentioned, majorly populist states. How do you sort of tackle that? And do you think there's a need for higher income countries to especially stand up in light of this and sort of push back on situations like that?
Thank you. Uri?
Did you ask me?
Yeah, oh. Yes, could you answer the question?
Okay, sorry. Yeah, Actually, of all the countries, I would not pick India as being sort of, the victim. India is a highly protected economy and has been a protectionist force, really, in the world now and in its own region for now many years. And you give me the opportunity to say one good thing about, the present American administration's attitude towards international trade, which is, there is a good thing. I think overall it's a bad thing because they're undermining the system in a very major way. But if there is a good thing, if there is a silver lining in this cloud, it is that there is some shakeup going on of the system because of the Trump administration's positions. And India is a good example of a country that is availing itself of developing country status and certain preferences. They're actually the biggest beneficiary of the general system of preferences of the United States. But at the same time has a highly protectionist attitude, has delayed the conclusion of RCEP for years, and then at the last moment pulled out of this very important agreement. And I think, the decision of the United States recently to take India off special and differential treatment of the GSP program is giving a signal to India that, it needs to change. Similarly, I think and we are certainly not at the end of this situation, the Trump administration vis-à-vis the Europeans, vis-à-vis the current account surplus of the Europeans, vis-à-vis the German current account surplus, and the threat of imposing tariffs on cars, which is an incendiary measure and would create a big problem, will confront eventually, because it's not going to happen before the election, the imposition of tariffs on cars coming from Europe. That's not going to happen before the election. That's clear to me. But after the election, if Trump is reelected, this issue will come to the fore again. And then the Europeans will themselves be confronted with the changes that they need to make. And these changes include, greater demand stimulus in Germany. They include modification of the tariff regimes of the Europeans, which have a 10% tariff on cars at the moment, whereas the United States has a 2% tariff on cars. And of course, it will include confronting some of the agricultural interests in Europe, which continue to have, the most cosseted and protected agricultural trade regime in the world, bar one or two exceptions. So these are some of the positive things. On net, it's a negative picture, but this is some of the positive things, in my view, that are coming out of the current debates. A lot of countries are having to say, well, let's look at what we are doing, yeah? Let's not only look at what China is doing or what the United States is doing, but what about our own policies, beginning with the Indians and the Europeans.
Thank you, Yuri. There are some people who say, I heard you on the shake-up, but there are some people who say that if you shake the trees too much, you destroy it.
You destroy it,
so
indeed.
that's something to keep in mind.
I agree.
A question?
I'm Plamen Todger from the Institute of International Economic Relations in Athens, Greece. I fully agree with Mr. Dadush that the United States is a core problem, if not the main culprit for today's mess in the rules-based order. But I don't intend to defend the United States or this United States with this particular leadership. But we may have to take a step back in time and remember that when China joined the WTO, it was on the premise that it would carry out major reforms between 2005 and 2016, over 12 years. Towards the end of 2016, both the United States and the EU decided that, in fact, those reforms had not been carried out within China's market, China's economy. And then Donald Trump was elected in late 2016. It doesn't seem to be a coincidence Could it be that Donald Trump, despite his personal style and his temperament, whatever, may actually reflect a school of thought which opposes this type of Chinese economy and the competition that China poses? Thank you.
Thank you.
A question. Do you want to address that really briefly, Matthias? I know that you were.
No, very quickly. I think that China became very uncomfortable at the WTO. It was accepted during the euphoria of the new liberal order, the end of history, and all that. The reforms, it's difficult to evaluate whether they comply to all of them or not, to 8%, 70%, or 60%. The point is that the context changed. It's not interesting. I agree with you. The blame is not on the United States, but only the system became uninteresting to it. That's all.
Okay. We'll take a couple comments from this side, questions, and then we'll toss it back to the panel.
Journaliste marocain. J'ai une double question, si vous le permettez. La première est relative à la dédollarisation et ce qu'elle pourrait avoir comme influence sur le commerce international. Et la deuxième, c'est la politique des sanctions donc, qui est menée aujourd'hui et qui grève le commerce international, que ce soit en Amérique latine ou dans le Machrek. Comment vous voyez les perspectives du commerce mondial à cet heure-là? Merci.
Merci.
Thank you. My name is Glenn Murray from Canada. I was one of the people involved in the development of the California, Ontario, Quebec cap and trade system. I just wanted to ask a question to the gentleman in the middle. You were talking about the link between deindustrialization and populism. In Ontario, which has the vast majority of industry, there was a great intention by previous provincial governments and the federal government to introduce carbon pricing in a way that massively reinvested in the existing industrial infrastructure, looking at the United Kingdom and steel and similar economy that deindustrialized, buys much of its steel from Turkey with a higher carbon footprint. But I'm interested in something very specifically, sort of the intersection of decarbonization, countries that are offshoring that, the trade confusion, the intersection of all of these things, and the rise of rather xenophobic nationalist politics. Where do you see that future to avoid these kinds of things?
Thank you. Matthias, Mr. Minister.
Thank you. There are lots of key questions, I think, in what has been raised. First, on de-dollarization.
De-dollarization or dollarization?
I can speak on that briefly from a European perspective, only, and it's linked with sanctions, by the way, saying that what we need to work on is to have the euro as a reference currency on the global stage. Without that, all the talk, which is legitimate and which is very future-oriented about European sovereignty, will be completely abstract and not followed in reality. If we want to be able to answer to extraterritorial sanctions, which is for us, and I think for lots of countries represented here in this room, a key issue. If we want to be able to answer to that quickly and effectively, we need reference currencies that are able to respond. And there have been some reflections in Europe on extraterritoriality. You know, when the US decide to sanction for non-respect of US laws, even if it's abroad by countries not based in the US and so on, it goes very far, very far. And we have to be able to construct our own tools on that. Then, just briefly, on, I think we should all have in mind that in the two countries who invented liberalism and made it a worldwide ideology, the UK and the US, today we have as head of state or government Mr. Trump and Mr. Johnson, and it means something very profound. I mean, it's not countries where you have a powerful state ideology for 200, 300 years and so on. It's quite different from my country. And so it means that the effect go very deep into our economies and into our societies.
Dominique Boquet, I'm Senior Fellow in the Policy Center. My question will deal with the US and their stand as to the future of the rule-based system. I think the question is not only their position towards WTO, but their position to the MFN, the most favored nation clause because they feel like they would like to get rid of it. Of course, it's an insurance very important for them too. But is it not too early for them to make a position on that, given that they are having some gains in their bilateral relation and discussion and tensions with China? So is it not too early to know what the stance of the US will be towards the MFN clause? Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll come here and then give you a chance.
Pose the question now. Hi, morning, and thank you very much. Thanks, John. Thanks for the panel. My name is Saeed El Hashimi. I work for the World Trade Organization, so you can understand this is a vital conversation for me, whether the WTO stays next year or no. But also having been a trade official for my country, Morocco, one of the learning processes is that you reach outcomes in negotiations through constructive ambiguity. So I liked when you used ambiguity. And I think when the parents conceived the baby here in Marrakesh in 1994, creating the WTO, there was a constructive ambiguity on the role of the dispute settlement. So for one part, it was an international court for trade, but for the others, the Americans from that time, it was just a quasi-judiciary system that should read the law only. So I want maybe your views. These seeds were planted then, and maybe this is just a... the second thing is,
what's the question, though, Saeed? You want our views on what?
On how do you see this, and will be these two positions reconcilable ever? How do you see that? And the second thing is on the future. I mean, with Uri, we discussed yesterday. I said, well, WTO has been always in a hole. We're just digging deeper this time. But I think in the conversation, maybe two things are missing, maybe, and maybe these are the seeds for a WTO reform. One is the role of the state in the economy, you know, subsidies, public subsidies in all, maybe many of our members, not only China. The second thing is technology. And as you know, I mean, we discussed this a lot of times, the notion of data has different meanings in different parts of the world. So for one country, I don't name countries because I'm an international civil servant, I don't do that, otherwise you lose your job. In one big country, it can be treated as any other thing. In one big country, big ensemble of countries, data is an individual right. And in one other big country, which is we talked about a lot, the data is the property of the state. So how do you see this reconcilable again? So I think part of the reform of the WTO is how we handle these conversations.
Thank you, Saeed. Did you want to tackle any of those questions, Jürgen?
Yeah. So I think both sets of questions relate to the United States, the interest and the position of the United States. Let me state that if there is a country that has a rules-based system, it's the United States, okay? Americans sue each other more frequently than any other country, but by a huge margin. The United States is based on rules, it is based on laws, okay? And it would be inconceivable to everybody, with the possible exception of one person, that the United States would favor a global system where rules do not apply. I mean, this is the way companies operate. I used to be in the private sector. You cannot operate in the private sector in an international market if you don't have forecastable rules. Or actually, more simply, where you don't have predictability in business relation, you know what you do? You don't do business if you don't have predictability in business relations. And that applies to European companies, but it certainly applies, or Japanese companies, but it certainly applies to American companies. So one way or another, sorry?
Just finish your thought.
Well, okay, so just to finish then, one way or another, the United States will revert to a rules-based system. But as Mr. Flôres has said, what will be the shape of this rules-based system? Okay, it may be very different than it is today, and there may be an element of rules-based where business will be conducted in a major way, and there may be areas that the United States will decide that, you know, the rules don't apply, in which case that will have very far-reaching consequences with respect to commercial relations. And that's why many Americans today, American firms and Chinese firms, are worried about the concept of decoupling, you know, taking China sort of and the United States and separating that, and then you have one system, and then you have a non-system on the other side, and that will lead to a collapse of commercial relations.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, but we want to take two thoughts over here.
Okay, thank you. Ahmed Azawi from Morocco. I'm not surprised that Africa has not been mentioned at all. Okay, we all know that Africa has been marginal, while Morocco is not a major actor in Africa either, despite its claim. In any case, Africa being marginalized in world trade, 4 to 5% at the most, but recently African countries have decided to create an Africa trade-free area, right? I'm wondering to what extent Africa can leverage its potential importance as a major actor by engaging in some sort of alliance or something like Mercosur or NAFTA with the EU and therefore become a major actor in world trade.
Mashroh, professeur universitaire et senior fellow Policy Center for the New South. Alors, je voudrais juste m'inscrire en faux par rapport à la démarche adoptée qui consiste à s'inscrire dans cette démarche un peu focalisée sur l'Amérique et d'oublier un peu le reste. Car je crois que si la démarche américaine reste critiquable par rapport à la forme, elle est pertinente sur beaucoup de questions. Je prends deux exemples principaux. L'organe d'appel permanent et la différenciation. Alors, l'organe d'appel permanent, il a profité de ce que M. Hashimi a appelé « constructive ambiguity » pour aboutir à outrepasser ses compétences qui lui sont accordées par le mémorandum d'accord sur le règlement des différends. Et les premiers pays à avoir critiqué l'organe d'appel, ce n'est pas les Américains, mais ce sont les pays en développement, sur des questions comme l'acceptation des mémoires adressées par les ONG, sur les questions d'étendre le délai des mandats des membres de l'organe d'appel au-delà du mandat. Et la question aujourd'hui, c'est que l'organe d'appel a profité énormément de la question du consensus négatif, qui consiste à ce que la décision adoptée par l'organe d'appel soit applicable, sauf si tous les membres de l'OMC soient contre, y compris celui qui a gagné l'affaire, ce qui reste improbable, et de décalage avec les organes politiques, où le consensus est positif et non pas négatif. Pour que la décision soit adoptée, il doit y avoir l'ensemble des acceptations de tous les membres de l'OMC. Donc aujourd'hui, la critique américaine, c'est de dire à l'organe d'appel aussi qu'il doit y avoir un équilibre et un respect des organes politiques. Sur la différenciation, j'imagine mal comment l'organe, ou plutôt comment la Chine, qui a aujourd'hui 14 000 milliards de dollars de produits intérieurs bruts, puisse bénéficier du même traitement spécial et différencié accordé aux pays en développement. Sur les continents africains, ils sont à moins de 1 200 milliards de dollars, donc 14 fois l'ensemble des pays africains, et ils profitent du même traitement spécial et différencié qui est accordé aux pays pauvres. Voilà, merci.
Merci. Did anyone who voted no wanted to talk about that vote? Why you voted no? Anyone who wanted to talk about that? Okay. We'll take one final question from the floor, and then I want to give you a few seconds. We'll have another vote in a few minutes.
I'm Alfredo Valadão. I'm a professor at Sciences Po in Paris and fellow here in the Policy Center. Just a small comment, and I agree with my friend Renato. WTO basically rules on trade on goods, which is primary goods or mass-produced goods that are the basic of trade in the world. But WTO doesn't take into account all the services coming up. The new value chain is much more complex than the ones that are ruled by internet, by many other new technologies, et cetera, et cetera. So my question or my comment is, isn't WTO going slowly to a kind of organization that will rule on old mass-produced products, which is good enough products for good enough consumers, where you have all, more or less, most of the southern countries go inside that, ruled by WTO, but all the new economy that's coming up, all the new digital economy coming up, will be ruled by plurilaterals or bilaterals or whatever, of the people who know that and who can master these things. So you could have a two-way system. An old system that is ruled by an old organization, and a new system that will be ruled by the big actors and how they organize between themselves.
Okay. As we wrap up, I noticed that someone was talking about sub-Saharan Africa, and I know you had your hand up for a minute. If we can get your comment in about 30 seconds. If you
Yes,
don't mind.
I will. Mine is very quick. Where does the Africa Free Trade Agreement fall in all this, especially when it comes to issues of around origins of the rules of origin?
Great, thank you. As we return to the panel, please, if you can take out your various devices, we'll have that question back up on the screen about whether you think the rules-based trading system will survive. If you can, please let us know how you think, and as you vote, we'll go down the list of wrap-up comments from our various speakers. We'll start with Yuri.
Yeah, so...
By the way, you have 30 seconds.
Yeah, on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, I think it's very important.
That's what you call efficiency.
Okay, right. Good. We got the point across.
Thank you.
Yeah. On the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, it's a very important agreement. It is very important for Africa in a context where the WTO is at risk of faltering. I don't think it's going to happen, but where the rules of the WTO are weakened by the crisis in the appellate body, etc., the free trade agreement within Africa becomes more important. It is important anyway for African countries to open up their markets and develop scale. But under the scenarios that we are looking at, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is much more important even than it was before. There was another question by the gentleman. All right. So forget it. Yeah.
Thank you, Yuri.
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, it's very interesting to have the vote beginning and the end.
Yeah,
concerning EU and Africa, I think that we have to completely change paradigm here too, that we have been in the past on an approach maybe inherited from history, and that now we have to be on a partnership approach among equal partners. That means predictability, that means reciprocity, and that means commitment to what we decide together. And when I see the know-how, the education, the dynamism in African countries, when you see now big countries emerging and becoming slowly but surely global players, that's the approach we have to integrate. And I think that things change on the European level in that regard. I would just like to conclude with one point. We listed what was missing in the debate. I think another thing, but it is discussed in other panels, it's how the European Green New Deal will impact the trade rules. It will, and what President von der Leyen just announced, will have a considerable impact when you look at the border adjustment tax on carbon, when you look at the ambition to become carbon neutral in a few decades. All this will reshape trade, and the key question will be, are we able to implement it in a socially fair way? And then things will work. If we fail on that, you will have yellow vests all over Europe and all over the world. And so the key is, how do we link again the issue of trade to the issues of social justice, of labor, and of environmental issues?
Great. Renato?
Very briefly, I would like to address the gentleman from WTO. You raised very interesting points. I have no time to tackle all of them, but only two. First, DSU, you are downright. Nobody anticipated at that time, in '94, what was going to happen with the system. There was positive or constructive ambiguity. That's normal in GATT, no? So nobody anticipated. And there was the euphoria because the veto point had been abolished, which married all the panels. If I put a veto to the panel is not approved. So you're right. Second point, data. You mentioned the most important thing, which links somehow to what my friend Valadon said, especially because I know his paper is a wonderful paper published by German Marshall Fund and OCP. Everybody should read his paper on this, is the following. I think the data issue is an issue by itself. You have data, you have cyber data, you have cybersecurity, you have artificial intelligence. In my view, this won't get into the WTO. WTO is unable to tackle this. This is the most important issue, and we are going to see sooner or later an international organization to tackle this. In my view, it's unavoidable. So, but this is another issue. And third and last point, Africa. The gentleman over there, you mentioned this recent big after free trade agreement. I think this may be a beginning. I look at this, as my Indian friends say, very auspiciously. I think this can be very, very auspicious issue. And Africa, my modest suggestion, as from someone from the South also, is that don't try to do coalitions with anybody. You should strengthen your union, because you are going to be the future. After Asia, now it's the Asian century to a certain extent. Afterwards, it's going to be Africa. You're going to be very powerful. And you can do alliances with the EU today, tomorrow with the US, the other day with ASEAN, the other day with China. I think it's very important that Africa becomes more and more powerful, particularly, and coming back to the panel, in this discussion of the new trade rules. You can have a big rule if you improve and move on from this gesture of the Africa free trade, which was very, very welcoming.
Thank you very much, Renato, and to everyone for the panel and your really insightful comment and interventions. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Join me in thanking the panel.
Good job, buddy.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your participation this morning. We will now break for lunch and reconvene at 2 o'clock. Please enjoy your meal.